Poverty is one of the oldest and hardest problems humanity has faced. For decades, experts have argued about big theories and one-size-fits-all solutions. Yet poverty continues to trap billions of people around the world. Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo's Poor Economics takes a different path. Instead of grand theories, it looks closely at the real lives of the poor, asking simple but powerful questions. Why do the poor make the choices they do? Why do some well-meaning aid programs fail while others succeed? And most importantly, what small, practical steps can actually help? The book challenges stereotypes and shows us that fighting poverty is not about ideology, but about evidence, understanding, and empathy. 1. Poverty is not just about money, it's about choices. When we observe the decisions made by people living in extreme poverty, they often seem puzzling or even self-defeating. Why would someone who struggles to afford basic food spend money on a television or a wedding? Why do some parents not invest in their children's education or health, even when it seems clearly beneficial in the long run? The poor are not irrational. In fact, they are often highly rational, making the best decisions they can within extremely difficult and limited circumstances. Being rational doesn't mean always choosing the ideal outcome. It means making choices based on your goals, knowledge, and the resources available to you. For people in poverty, the world is full of trade-offs and uncertainties. A seemingly small decision, like spending a few dollars on better-tasting food rather than more calories, can make sense when you realize that their lives are filled with stress, monotony, and a constant sense of struggle. The joy of eating something pleasant can bring a moment of relief in a life with few pleasures. That's not irrational. It's deeply human. One of the most powerful ideas in poor economics is that scarcity shapes how people think. When you're poor, your mental energy is consumed by urgent needs. How to eat tonight, how to get medicine for a sick child, how to keep the lights on. You don't have the luxury of long-term planning because you're constantly putting out fires. This leads to a kind of mental tunnel vision, where only the immediate matters. In this context, choices that might look short-sighted from the outside are actually completely logical. A key example from the book illustrates this well. When researchers looked at why poor families weren't buying more nutritious food, they found that it wasn't because they didn't value health. It was because they didn't see immediate results, or they didn't believe the information they were given. Buying food that tastes good today offers certain emotional value. So the lesson is this: people in poverty are not fundamentally different from anyone else. They are thoughtful, strategic, and practical. But they face a world full of risk, scarcity, and uncertainty. Their decisions reflect the constraints they live under, not a failure to understand what's best for them. When we stop blaming the poor for their choices and instead start to understand the conditions under which those choices are made, we begin to see the real shape of poverty, not just as a lack of money, but as a lack of reliable options, security, and trust. 2. Intervention. The second lesson from poor economics is that small, well-designed interventions can lead to surprisingly large improvements in the lives of the poor. This idea goes against the assumption that solving poverty always requires massive, expensive programs or sweeping economic reforms. Instead, Banerjee and Duflo show that modest changes, based on careful observation and testing, often make a bigger difference than grand theories. One of the clearest examples they give is from public health. In many low-income countries, vaccines are free, yet vaccination rates remain low. You might expect that the solution is better education about vaccines or better clinics. But in a study conducted in rural India, simply offering a small bag of lentils as an incentive for parents to bring their children to a vaccination center significantly increased the number of children receiving life-saving vaccines. The change was simple, cheap, and effective. Not because it transformed the entire health system, but because it addressed a specific, overlooked barrier: the lack of a compelling short-term reward. The same applies to education. In Kenya, researchers found that giving children access to textbooks didn't significantly raise test scores. But when schools provided remedial tutoring targeted to students who had fallen behind, often just 1 hour a day, their performance improved dramatically. The key insight here is that adding more resources doesn't always help unless they're aligned with the real needs of the people they're meant to serve. A one-size-fits-all approach often fails because it assumes all students or all patients or all families are at the same starting point. They're not. Small changes matter because they often deal with the last-mile problems, the little frictions that prevent people from accessing things they are already entitled to, or that would clearly benefit them. A medicine might be free, but if people don't know where to get it, or if they don't trust the provider, or if they have to travel far and lose a day's wages to obtain it, they may choose not to take it. Solving these problems doesn't require re-engineering the entire healthcare system. It might just mean sending a reminder, offering a tiny incentive, or improving how services are delivered at the local level. Another powerful example is deworming. Intestinal worms affect millions of school-aged children in developing countries, sapping their energy and making it harder to concentrate. Deworming medication is cheap and easy to administer, yet it wasn't widely used. Randomized trials showed that simply organizing regular school-based deworming campaigns had a dramatic effect, not just on health, but on attendance and long-term outcomes. Again, a small intervention, barely noticed by the broader policy world, had a long-lasting impact. This lesson forces us to rethink how we define impact. Often, policymakers and donors are attracted to programs that sound transformational on paper. Huge infrastructure projects, national reforms, economic liberalization. But these are slow, costly, and often ineffective for the poorest citizens. By contrast, the most effective interventions tend to be local, grounded in human behavior, and rooted in the specific realities of the poor. They succeed not by changing everything at once, but by removing one important obstacle at a time. 3. Education and healthcare. The third major lesson from poor economics is that decisions about education and health, two areas often seen as essential for escaping poverty, are far more complex for the poor than they appear to outsiders. These decisions are not simply a matter of lacking money or awareness. They're shaped by deep uncertainty, weak institutions, and a lifetime of inconsistent experiences with systems that are supposed to help. Let's start with education. It's easy to assume that all parents everywhere want to send their children to school, and that if children aren't attending, it must be due to cost or cultural resistance. But what Banerjee and Duflo find is more subtle. Parents in poor communities do value education, but they often make tough, strategic choices based on what they believe their child's future holds. If a family thinks only the smartest child has a chance at success, they may invest heavily in one child and pull the others out to work. It's not because they don't care. It's because their life experience has taught them that average schooling rarely leads to real economic mobility. In many countries, especially where the job market is distorted or public employment is limited, a high school diploma doesn't guarantee a better future. So parents ask a hard question. Is it worth sacrificing income or labor at home to send a child to school if the return is uncertain or negligible? That's a rational question when the education system is failing, when teachers don't show up, when students don't learn, and when diplomas don't translate into jobs. And because poor families face constant financial pressure, they tend to treat both education and health as investments that require a visible return. If a child misses school for a week and nothing bad seems to happen, they may not see why consistent attendance matters. If a cheap pill from a local vendor makes a fever go away, they may not see the value of a full course of antibiotics or a doctor's visit. What matters is whether the solution works now, not whether it meets a global standard of care or long-term outcomes. In wealthy countries, people tend to trust doctors and teachers by default. In poor communities, that trust must be earned, and too often, it hasn't been. A single bad interaction, being sent home without medicine, having a teacher ignore your child, being overcharged at a clinic, can shape how a family engages with public services for years. People adapt to this reality. They build their own strategies, rely on informal providers, and use trial and error instead of official channels. The real insight here is that demand for education and healthcare isn't fixed. It depends heavily on the quality, consistency, and credibility of the services offered. If you improve those things, behavior changes quickly. For instance, when teachers were monitored more closely and attendance improved, so did student learning. When clinics were better stocked and outreach improved, people started seeking care earlier. So instead of blaming poor families for not using services that seem obviously important, the question becomes, how can systems be made trustworthy, responsive, and worth the effort? How can we create environments where attending school or going to a clinic feels like a smart investment because it actually is? 4. Credit. The fourth lesson from poor economics challenges a widely held belief that access to credit, especially microcredit, is the magic bullet for lifting people out of poverty. Banerjee and Duflo carefully unpack this idea and show that, while microfinance can help, it is not a transformative tool for most poor people. The assumption that the poor are all natural entrepreneurs, just waiting for a small loan to launch a business, doesn't hold up when you look closely at the data or their daily lives. The microcredit movement exploded in the 1990s and 2000s with a simple and compelling story. The poor can't get loans from banks because they lack collateral, so they're stuck in poverty. Microcredit institutions stepped in, offering small loans to individuals or groups, often with no collateral, under the assumption that this access would allow borrowers to start businesses, generate income, and escape poverty. But what Banerjee and Duflo found was far more nuanced. Yes, people took the loans. Yes, repayment rates were high. But the idea that the poor were all just waiting to launch successful businesses was largely a myth. Most borrowers used the loans not to grow a business, but to smooth consumption, buy food during a tough month, pay for a child's school fees, or deal with a medical emergency. And those who did start businesses often did so out of necessity, not ambition. These businesses were usually small-scale, low-growth, and highly vulnerable to shocks. In other words, microcredit helped people survive, but it rarely helped them transform their economic situation. 5. Poverty traps exist, but they are not permanent. The fifth lesson from poor economics is a quiet revolution in how we think about solving poverty. Ideology doesn't work. Evidence does. In a field dominated for decades by big theories and political battles, Banerjee and Duflo offer something radically different and refreshingly humble. We don't need to guess what works. We can test it. For most of modern development economics, policies were driven by sweeping ideas. On one side, there were those who believed in free markets, trickle-down growth, and minimal government. On the other, those who championed heavy state intervention, subsidies, and top-down planning. Both camps were passionate. Both had theories, but often neither had proof. What poor economics argues is that poverty is too complex, too deeply tied to local realities, to be solved by a one-size-fits-all ideology. Instead of relying on abstract theories, we need to treat development like a science experiment, testing ideas in the real world, measuring outcomes, and learning what actually works on the ground. That's where randomized controlled trials, RCTs, come in. This approach, borrowed from medicine, allows researchers to evaluate development programs with real rigor. Two villages are alike in every way. One gets the program, the other doesn't. Then you track what happens. Did school attendance go up? Did incomes rise? Did health improve? This method may sound basic, even obvious, but its implications are profound. It means no more blind faith in big theories. No more investing billions in programs because they feel right or align with a political agenda. Instead, you follow the evidence. And the results of this approach are often surprising. Sometimes, programs that sound brilliant on paper don't work in practice. Other times, small, boring-sounding tweaks, like reminding people to take their medicine or giving teachers feedback, end up having outsized impacts. Evidence allows us to be surprised, to change direction, to admit when we were wrong. What makes this lesson powerful isn't just its logic, it's the humility it demands. It says, we don't have all the answers. We shouldn't pretend to. But we can learn. We can try things, measure them, and improve. That mindset, a kind of scientific curiosity mixed with empathy, is at the heart of what Banerjee and Duflo propose. In a field often driven by slogans, the idea of experimenting, adjusting, and learning may seem slow or unglamorous. But it is precisely this approach that gives us the best chance at real, lasting progress, because it treats poverty not as a puzzle to be solved from a distance, but as a series of real problems, in real places, faced by real people.